Yes, so that's the question that we're going to discuss for the next 30 minutes. Should Christians keep the Sabbath? What do you think? Would you say, no, we shouldn't? Yes, we should. Well, the answer actually is both. Yes and no. And as we progress with our talk today, we will qualify that comment. So should Christians keep the Sabbath? The very first reference or use of the word Sabbath in the Bible was when Jehovah provided the manna to the Israelites very soon after they crossed the Red Sea. And he at that time said that they could, that the manna would be provided for 6 days, but then on the 7th day there would be no manna to collect, and the Israelites therefore would be forced to rest. So he introduced the idea of a Sabbath, and then about a month or so later, the Sabbath law was formalized at Mount Sinai when they got to Mount Sinai. And there at Exodus 20, verses 8 to 10, we have the situation, Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 to 10, where Jehovah gave 10 commandments. 10 commandments. And those commandments were to binding upon the whole nation, and they formed the foundation of the 400 to 600 other laws that constituted the law of Moses. So let's read now chapter 20, and this is the fourth of the 10 commandments in verse 10. And it says there, remember the Sabbath day to keep it sacred. You are to labor and do all your work for 6 days, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to Jehovah your God. You must not do any work, neither you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your slave man, nor your slave girl, nor your domestic animal, nor your foreign resident who is inside your settlements. So none of them, notice, even their domestic animals were not to do any work. And then Jehovah makes this comment, for in 6 days Jehovah made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and he began to rest on the 7th day. So we remember the Genesis account, and that is why Jehovah blessed the Sabbath day and made it sacred. So there we have, we saw the image of Moses with the 10 commandments, the 2 tablets there, and the fourth one was there very specifically saying that they were to keep the Sabbath day. And so a lot of people would jump to the conclusion, oh, well, if it's in the 10 commandments, then it is binding upon Christians. But we'll come to that a little bit later. Let's talk about, first of all, where does the idea, the Hebrew word for Sabbath, what does it mean and its derivation? In Hebrew, it's something like Shabbat, and it's derived from a verb, shavat, which means to rest, cease, or desist. So, and that's the idea of a day, a formal day of resting, ceasing, or desisting from work. Now, the Jewish Sabbath, because Jewish days didn't start and end at midnight like our days do, but Jewish days, as you would well know, start and end at sundown. And so the Jewish Sabbath was on the 7th day, as specified in the 10 Commandments, the 7th day, and that began on our reckoning on Friday evening when the sun went down. And then it would go for 24 hours to Saturday evening. And then Saturday after sundown began the new week, day 1 of the new week. But day 7 of the week, just like on our calendars, Saturdays are day 7. So the Jewish day, by going from sundown to sundown, Friday evening to Sunday evening was the Sabbath. the Sabbath day was actually only the basic fundamental component for a whole system of Sabbaths that was built upon it. For example, the Jehovah required that they have every 7th year that they would have a rest, and that the land would have a rest. And so they were not to pick any of the fruit that the trees might bear. They were not to plant or harvest crops for that whole year. And that was a good thing, wasn't it? Because even now, good agricultural practice involves letting the land rest occasionally. So every 7th year, and during that year, they were not allowed to press their fellow Israelites for payment of debts. So all debts could be postponed to the end of the year, right? And unless the person wanted to pay it earlier, of course. Also, every 50th year was a special Sabbath, and it was called the Jubilee. And in that year, it was setting free of prisoners. All property reverted back to the ancestral families that owned it originally. If it had been sold in the meantime to pay off debts or whatever, it reverted back on the Sabbath. What a beautiful thing that was to the ancestral families who owned it. In addition to the weekly Sabbath, the 7th year Sabbath, and the 50th year Sabbath, every year there were 8 special days or festival days that were special Sabbaths, and regardless of what day of the week they fell on. Now, this law about the Sabbath for the Jews was very serious. If you open your Bible again to Exodus, and now we'll look at chapter 31 and verses 14 and 15, notice what Jehovah said there to the Israelites. Exodus 31, 14 and 15, "You must keep the Sabbath, for it is something holy to you. Whoever profanes it must be fined or put in prison? No, put to death. If anyone does any work on it, then that person must be cut off from among his people. 6 days' work may be done, but on the 7th day is a Sabbath of complete rest. It is something holy to Jehovah. Anyone doing work on the Sabbath day must be put to death." So that was very serious. And even the annual, the 7-year Sabbaths were treated as very serious from Jehovah's point of view. So much so that when the Babylonians came and destroyed Jerusalem in 607 BCE and took any survivors off into exile into Babylon, they stayed there for 70 years. And the Bible specifically says that was to fulfill the debt of all the Sabbath years that the Jews had not kept. And Jehovah viewed that as an outstanding debt. And so he sent them off the land for 70 years to now force them to give the land a 70-year rest. Now, what was the purpose of the Sabbath? Well, it served a number of excellent purposes. First of all, while we have Exodus 31 there, well, you might have it. I'd close my Bible. Exodus 31, could we have a look at verse 14 and 15? No, we read that. 16 and 17, the next 2 verses. It says, "The Israelites must keep the Sabbath. They must observe the Sabbath during all their generations. It is a lasting covenant." Between who? Well, it explains, it is an enduring sign between me, Jehovah, and all of mankind, all of God's worshippers. No, it says, and the people of Israel. For in 6 days Jehovah made the heavens and the earth, and on the 7th day he rested and refreshed himself. So there it says that the Sabbath law was an enduring sign between Jehovah and the people of Israel. And so it really was one of many things that set the Jews apart and distinct as God's people. They were a people who kept a Sabbath, a day off a week. Now, we view it as our right to have a day off a week or 2 days a week off from work, do we not? The weekend has become quite sacred in our secular society. But in ancient times, generally, most people just worked 7 days a week. Most nations did. They might have had a few religious festivals, but basically they worked 7 days a week. And certainly the Israelites did when they were prisoners in Egypt. They had to work 7 days a week. No idea of a day off. So this, in the ancient world, this idea of having 1 day off a week from work was basically instituted by Jehovah. He brought in this idea, and it, of course, spread to other nations. So that's one purpose of the Sabbath. It was a sign between Jehovah and the nation of Israel to set them apart and distinct from other nations as being uniquely his people. Secondly, the Sabbath provided for physical rest for Israelites, their slaves, their domestic animals, even the soil of the ground, and so forth. And so here we see an image of Joseph and Mary, Jesus' parents, and here they are on the Sabbath day, and look, what are they doing? Oh, they're enjoying dinner together, telling stories, having a good time. And in a way, the Sabbath was like an enforced lockdown. And now most of us have positive, negative views of the lockdown. But one good thing, many will say, is it brought their families closer together. It forced them to stay at home. And on the Sabbath, everybody had to stay at home or very close to home. And this kind of forced time upon parents that they couldn't just keep working, they were forced to spend time with their marriage mates and their children. So what a beautiful provision that was from Jehovah. And it was a chance to rest, of course. Now, a third benefit is from the Sabbath was that it gave them an opportunity to focus on their spiritual needs. And that was to read God's law, to discuss God's law as a family, to teach the children, and to go to the synagogue. That is, after they returned from Babylon, they had synagogues in each community. And the Sabbath day was the day for the whole family to go to the synagogue and to be taught by Jehovah. And as we see here, Mary and Joseph, Jesus, James, and so forth, going to the synagogue. So what a beautiful thing that was. They couldn't just work 24/7. They were, as a family, forced to spend time on spiritual things. Fourthly, the Sabbath law taught, or in a way forced, the Israelites to trust in Jehovah for him to rely, for him to provide for them. They had to rely on Jehovah because that was 1/7 of their income that they were not going to get, was it? You know, they couldn't just work 24/7. They were forced to have a day off, and that was a loss of income. And when they had a Sabbath year, wow, that really tested their trust in Jehovah. But right from the very start, when Jehovah provided the manna, even before the Mount Sinai, he provided manna every day, and on the sixth day, he provided double to make sure they had enough for the next day. So you see, the Israelites learnt very much through this object lesson of the Sabbath and the manna to trust in Jehovah, that Jehovah would provide for them. So we see that the law of the Sabbath was a beautiful gift from Jehovah. It was truly a blessing from a loving and generous God. The Sabbath day was meant to be a time to rejoice, to draw closer together as friends and family and communities. It was meant to be refreshing. It was never meant to be a burden. And yet, therein lies a problem. You see, the law, the way it was written in God's word, didn't cover every possible scenario. It didn't have a list of specifically every last little thing they could or couldn't do. It was pretty broad. Basically, what we've read today was all that they knew as to what they could and couldn't do on the Sabbath. Now, the Jews, especially the rabbis, they didn't like that gray area. And so they started to now, with a whole lot of nitpicking rules and traditions, get down to very specific things that the Jews could or couldn't do on the Sabbath. Not only couldn't they travel, but exactly how far could they travel. All right. They had, in fact, in the Talmud, which is the written compilation of all the oral traditions of the Jews, that it was compiled together soon after the time of Christ and put in the form of the Talmud, right? This contains some 39 categories of Sabbath restrictions, 39 different categories of Sabbath restrictions with thousands of lesser rules. And they filled 2 large volumes, all these rules, technical rules that the rabbis devised regarding what they could and couldn't do on the Sabbath. And as a result, instead of having a joyful and spiritually refreshing time, the law of the Sabbath became a burden on the people and difficult, if not impossible, for the average working man to actually keep some of the laws. Unreasonable things. They said, for example, oh, you're not allowed to go hunting on the Sabbath. Okay. So that means even if you've got a flea on you, you're not allowed to catch it. No, that's hunting. Certainly not allowed to kill it, right? Because you weren't allowed to do that on the Sabbath. You weren't allowed to write because, you see, that required manual effort, writing, right? You couldn't light a fire, but nor could you extinguish a fire. Even just the act of going, no, that violated the Sabbath. So if your house caught fire in the Sabbath, you were not allowed to put it out unless lives were threatened. So if you got out of the house, you just had to let it burn, right? A sick or injured person couldn't be given any relief or assistance, bandaged or whatever, on the Sabbath. So if they had a broken bone or sprained ankle or something, no, couldn't be treated. Only truly life-threatening emergencies could be dealt with in the Sabbath. Was this Jehovah's intention? Hardly so. And yet that was the world that Jesus, or the society that Jesus came into when he came to the earth. And as a result of all these man-made rules, the people were burdened under these heavy loads, and this resulted in many conflicts that Jesus had with the religious leaders. For example, as we see in this next picture, there was the situation described in Mark 2, 23 and 24. Mark chapter 2, 23 and 24. So let's read that account if we could. Mark chapter 2, 23 and 24. It says, now, as he was passing through the grain fields on the Sabbath, his disciples started to pluck the heads of the grain as they went. Well, you see, oh, that's harvesting. And then they would have rubbed it between their hands to, as you can see there, and that was threshing. It says, so the Pharisees, and you see them there in the distance, they saw this, and they said to him, look, here, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath? Well, so they felt that this minor thing that they were doing, they were hungry, just grabbing a bit of food, right, like that. It wasn't against the law to eat, but harvesting and threshing, yeah, that was. But did this really constitute harvesting and threshing when they were hungry? Well, according to the Pharisees, it did. Now, then Jesus reasons on some Bible examples with them to show that they were extreme in their view, right? And then, if you read verse 27 and 28, he made a very interesting comment. Then he said to them, the Sabbath came into existence for the sake of man, and not man for the sake of the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. Now that's interesting. Jesus helped them to get their priorities right. Don't put the cart before the horse. Humans existed and were created on this earth long before God introduced the Sabbath law, right? Humans were not created to keep the Sabbath. No, but the Sabbath was created as a blessing for humans, beneficial to them. You see, man was not created for the Sabbath was created for man. And then he said, so the Son of Man himself, Jesus, is Lord even of the Sabbath. Now, if you're Lord of something, it means you can control it, you have authority over it. And what he was saying is that, look, as God's representative, I have authority to actually do good deeds on the Sabbath and do a whole lot of things on the Sabbath because God has sent me. I am Lord even of the Sabbath. So those verses are very interesting. Jesus went on to reason at different times with the Pharisees, for example. He said, well, look, if the Sabbath was so life and death and that God meant it, you know, as a universal requirement on all mankind under all circumstances, why does he let the priests and the Levites work in the temple on the Sabbath day? They slaughtered animals, they offered sacrifices, they did all sorts of manual work. Nothing changed in the Sabbath except they got busier on the Sabbath, right? They did more work on the Sabbath, and yet that was allowed. So if it was intrinsically wrong to do any work on the seventh day, surely not those in the central place of God's worship would be allowed to work. So that's very good reasoning, isn't it? So Jesus helped them to see that they'd missed the whole point of the law, and they had effectively, with their nitpicking technicalities, they had shifted the focus, and now they had violated the very purpose of the law of the Sabbath and had turned it into, instead of something refreshing, but into a burden. And this, friends, is always a problem with laws or rules. Rules beget more rules. Rules need other rules to prop them up, generally speaking. And that's why the law books of Australia and every country are thousands and thousands of different rules, because as soon as you make a rule, you need a multitude of little rules to make it work, don't you? And you've got to consider all the different situations that it applies, doesn't apply, and so forth. And this, we see that when there's a code of laws, it presents that problem. It also can be counterproductive for a servant of God if he becomes overly focused on laws and rules, because then he can jump to the mistaken conclusion that if I keep this all the technicalities of this rule, I'm going to prove how good and righteous I am. You see, if I can tick off all of these, it proves that I'm righteous. And that's what the Jewish religion had become all about in Jesus' time. Paul made that comment or observation in Romans 10, verses 2 to 5. Romans 10, verses 2 to 5. And he talked about the Jewish nation. And he himself was a Jew. He was an ex-Pharisee. He says, for I bear them witness that they have a zeal for God, but not according to accurate knowledge. For because of not knowing the righteousness of God, but notice, seeking to establish their own righteousness, they did not subject themselves to the righteousness of God. And the Jewish religion was all about trying to prove how righteous they were, or self-righteous, right? Not righteous necessarily in God's eyes, but they ticked all the boxes maybe. And generally it was prejudicial towards people who are wealthy, who didn't need to work, who had servants, for example, and so forth. It was easy for them to tick all the boxes. They did everything right on the Sabbath, right? As Christians, we know that righteousness with God is not dependent upon us being perfect. In fact, that just creates a whole burden. The moment we think incorrectly that we can prove how right we are by keeping the Sabbath or any other of those Mosaic laws. The Mosaic law was never meant to be permanent. And so if we open to Jeremiah 31, verses 31 to 33, it makes the point there that Jehovah purposed, and this was written 600 years before Jesus came to the earth. In Jeremiah 31 and verse 31 to 33, Jehovah already showed that he was going to remove and replace the Mosaic law covenant. He says there in verse 31, "Look, the days are coming, declares Jehovah, when I will make the house of Israel, with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, a new covenant. It will not be like the covenant that I made with their forefathers on the day I took hold of their hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt. It says, my covenant that they broke, although I was their true master, declares Jehovah." He says, "For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days." Now, this is spiritual Israel with Christians. Declares Jehovah, "I will put my law within them, and in their heart I will write it, and I'll become their God, and they'll become my people." So you see, when a person discerns principles, when it's engraved in his heart, he doesn't need a whole lot of technical rules, you see. So for us as Christians, for example, we know that the law of Moses was done away with. When was that? Well, if we have a look at our next image, if we have a look at Colossians 2, 13 and 14, it makes clear, Colossians 2, 13 and 14, it makes clear when this happened. It says, "Furthermore, though you were dead in your trespasses and in the uncircumcised state of your flesh, God made you alive together with him. He kindly forgave us all our trespasses," and notice, "erased the handwritten document," that's all the laws of Moses, "that consisted of decrees and was in opposition to us. He has taken it out of the way by nailing it to the torture stake." So as it were, quite graphically, the law of Moses was nailed with Jesus on the stake to die. It died when he died. Well, that's a good thing. Why so? Well, if you have a look in verses 16 and 17, Paul applies it. He says, "Therefore, don't let anyone judge you about what you are to eat and what you are to eat and drink, or about the observance," notice, "of a festival, or of the new moon, or what? Of a Sabbath. Those things are a shadow of the things to come, but the reality belongs to the Christ." Ah, yes, they were just like a shadow. A shadow in itself has no substance. It has no value, does it? Except when you look at a shadow, you can work out the shape of, generally, the rough outline of what it is a shadow of. But the reality is the real thing. And we don't fall in love with a shadow. The Mosaic law was a shadow. But the reality belongs to Christ. And the wonderful good news is that as Christians, we can enter into a peaceful rest with God, not just one day a week, but 7 days a week, 24/7. For all eternity, we can enter into a state of restful peace with God. We can, by becoming Jesus' disciples, he teaches us how to submit to Jehovah in every part of our life, whilst at the same time, his sacrifice gives us refreshment because we can have our sins forgiven. So we don't need to keep berating ourselves if we aren't able to keep God's law perfectly. No, the reality belongs or is through Jesus Christ that he has brought. So as Christians, we can find true refreshment. So to answer that, our initial question, should Christians keep the Sabbath? Well, no, we don't keep the Jewish Sabbath, the seventh day of the week. Oh, if you wanted to, you could. That would not be wrong, but it's not required by Jehovah that we do so. What Jehovah does require is that we enter into a peaceful rest with him, to have his approval, to enter into this beautiful relationship with Jehovah and having his approval. When we do that, what's the result to us? Well, we are effectively enjoying a Sabbath 7 days a week, every day of our life we are giving to Jehovah. And that was the very spirit and essence of the law. And Jesus captured that. And if we could have our last image and our final scripture to show the wonderful blessings of the Christian Sabbath, if we can have a look at Matthew 11:28 to 30. And this describes the Sabbath resting that we can and should enjoy. Matthew chapter 11, I will get there, verses 28 to 30. And Jesus said, "Come to me, all you who are toiling and loaded down, and I will refresh you. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am mild-tempered and lowly in heart, and you will find true refreshment for yourselves. For my yoke is kindly and my load is light." May we accept that load, that yoke from Jesus, and may we too enjoy the refreshment that keeping the Christian Sabbath will bring us.